Martin Buber, mid-20th century theologian, said it well, that ultimately love of the Creator and love of that which God has created are one and the same. If you don't love creation, what does it mean to say that you love God who so loved creation? So the two are, from the very opening verses of Genesis all the way to the last surah in the Holy Quran or any other great revelation, consistently speak about a God who put the universe into play and cares deeply about it. And with whatever degree of literalism or however figuratively we approach the sacred text, if we get one idea, it's that God is big and stands for oneness and interconnection, and we take our humble, smaller place as part of that chorus of praise. The earth is God's and the fullness thereof. I think of it as God is the landlord and we are tenants. And it's very easy for tenants who trash an apartment to forget conveniently that there's a landlord who could issue warnings and ultimately an eviction notice. Psalm 24, Deuteronomy chapter 11 says the same thing, that God is the landlord, and that if we don't pay the rent and we don't maintain the apartment, then an eviction notice is a possibility. And I don't know what else rising seas and loss of such a huge amount of the genetic diversity that God put on Earth, and increasing vectors for communicable disease. I don't know what those are, if not the warnings that lead to the eviction note. And I think the reason why the Jewish tradition is built so much around the Passover story is to hold us accountable, to say any of us could be Pharaoh, don't. In fact, the Torah teaches over and over that you should not oppress a stranger, you should love a stranger, because you know the heart of a stranger. You were one in Egypt. And whether that applies to immigration issues or whether that applies simply to the reality of climate change refugees and people who are affected by this, Passover is a warning about many of the key issues of the day, climate perhaps number one among them. Classical Jewish law has not 10 commandments, but 613, and number 529 comes from Deuteronomy, chapter 20, verse 19. It's a law in wartime about not cutting down the enemy's trees, even when it could give you military advantage and perhaps even save combatants' lives. You're still not allowed because the trees are not your enemy. What I love about the rabbis in the Talmud almost 2,000 years ago, they elucidated an entire environmental ethic out of that one scriptural reference by saying, if we're not allowed to cut down a tree that belongs to the enemy under such dire circumstances, how much more should we not allow trees to be felled simply for the convenience of the international economy? I think there are three moral calls related to climate change. One is for all of creation. God created millions of species, or call it the creative power of the universe that God got going, created speciation. We have all this biodiversity and we're losing it. In the sixth great extinction in geological time, we are the cause. We are the asteroid this time. That's bad enough. Then there's the human health impact, particularly to the least of these. When you think about disease and the loss of economy, the loss of farmland, the rising of floods and of sea rise, the most vulnerable populations are the poorest folks who didn't do very much to bring the climate crisis about, but they're the first victims. If we care about poverty, if we care about people, if we believe that love your neighbor as yourself means something, then we need to respond to climate change with all of the moral and religious urgency that we have. And finally, it's also le dor vador, as our tradition says, from generation to generation. This is a cumulative impact crisis. We have not even begun to see the worst of what we ourselves have wrought, because carbon stays in the atmosphere for 100 years. That's the third and fourth generation of which Exodus 34 speaks. Religion is the sector that thinks intergenerationally. And we know that these things are getting worse. We know that in the grand scheme, this question of how healthy and how vibrant an ecosystem, how resilient a set of natural systems we leave for our descendants will be how we are measured in the 21st century. There are other great issues that also demand our attention, but this is in many ways the overarching moral concern. And we can do right on everything else, but if we ignore this, then we are quite literally swamped. So if you make an investment in something very unsexy and unreligious, like a really efficient boiler, it makes a tremendous difference. Sometimes stewardship, both in the financial and the environmental sense, is in those little behind-the-scenes ways where you can make the biggest difference. So it's been very good for the bottom line of the congregation. It's also been very good for the sense of why people are involved in a religious community. We have gained new members and retained wavering members because they see that this is a place that is making a difference and sending a message and training a generation of people with all the profundity of the faith tradition and ritual and language to be better stewards of creation. Climate change is going to cause food scarcity, the likes of which we have never seen. So people who are now putting energy into staffing local soup kitchens, that is well-placed energy. It is sacred volunteerism, but the scope of the number of hungry people is about to radically shift because of what we do. So if you drive your gas guzzler to volunteer at the soup kitchen, are you making things better or worse? We need to begin to ask those tough questions. One day in 7 is, of course, Sabbath, and that is a day of just being, not of doing. It's a stepping back from the rat race of production and consumption. And as Jews, it's our most special time. It's also the goal to which we hope the other days can measure up. So if the most special time is when we are not polluting, it is when we are not consuming, it is when we are being, when we are creating community and music and poetry and fellowship, then we have redefined what is good in society. So Sabbath, Shabbat, and with it the sabbatical cycle of every 7th year and the Jubilee of every 49th, reminds us that we need to create those islands in time for meaning, and those need to then become the radiant centers on the calendar that infuse the other days, the other years, with that spirit of sustainability. If there's one core Jewish teaching or contribution to the environmental discourse, I really think it is Shabbat. The idea that the most special, most sacred time is not about production and consumption, it's about enjoyment and being.
And that will radiate out in the other 6 days of the week if you...
It's already beginning to. If you bring a Sabbath consciousness to the week, which is what so much of Sabbath worship is about, trying to make sure that we don't only have our religious experience on Sunday morning or Friday prayer or Saturday. It's about letting that spirit infuse the rest of the week. And for Sabbath, it's a spirit of sustainability.
And when you talk about materialism, you're talking about consumerism, that maybe we're way too preoccupied with consuming?
Absolutely. In the Mishnah 2,000 years ago, it asks, who is rich? And the answer is whoever is happy with their lot. So much of tradition is to remind us to be content with what we have and to redefine, move the goalposts of happiness. It's not consumer goods. It's not more things, all of which are produced and disposed of with some marginal social and environmental cost. The true sources of meaning are that which religion has specialized in for thousands of years. It's poetry and music and worship and fellowship. These things matter and they sustain us.